Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. Well, John, we laughingly only made it through not even one verse so far in our attempts to do Acts 18 to 23. So even when we think it's going to take us longer, it still trips us up.
Yes, I was just reflecting before we hit the record button that we have spent the last two podcasts in one verse, essentially, 18:18, and to our lovely listeners, we hope you don't mind that, but it does show the richness of the text. That if you're sort of prepared to stop a little bit and pause, then my goodness, there are huge reflections within that. But yes, we're not moving desperately fast at the moment. Yeah.
And so what we'll do, because it's been a few weeks, if you're listening to these episodes live, it's a few weeks since we then read the chapters that we're looking at. Let's have a reminder, John. We've got Paul. He's stayed in Corinth. He's now sailed for Syria with Priscilla and Aquila. They've had his hair cut off in Cenchrea because of a vow. So let me just refresh us on verse 19 onwards. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
So Acts 18 verse 19 says, they arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. And then he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there, traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples.
Yeah.
I figured that we just don't read verse 18 because it may slow us down even more. But so instantly you've got this. He arrives in Ephesus and actually goes into the synagogue, despite what we've had happen earlier on with him saying this is not going to be his strategy anymore. Did you notice that and think that was interesting?
I did sort of pick that up immediately in terms of it clearly, though he's had a bad experience in Corinth, here he is back in Ephesus and sort of, okay, let's have another go at this and see what can happen. So I love the fact that Paul is still open to adapt and to change. So, Corinth was a bit painful for him, and we saw him literally go next door and almost, take the believers out. And yet here he is finding the synagogue at Ephesus and re-engaging with what is or has been a well-worn strategy for him. Go to the synagogue first, if there is one, and then fan out from there. So I love that idea that in such a major city, there is a significant Jewish presence, and Paul wants to take advantage of that. And of course, Ephesus is a major coastal city. So yeah, I love the fact that Paul's able to adapt and change within that.
And obviously I found myself pondering whether Priscilla and Aquila are related to this as well. So Paul's statement is, I'm just going to go to Gentiles now. But he's also got Priscilla and Aquila with him, who of course are, Jewish refugees from Rome. So is it possible that, a complete silence as far as I'm aware on this, but is it possible that with them around him, he feels a little bit more, okay, let's see what these conversations are. Regardless, what I loved about it was, if you've heard somebody say that Paul says, I'm now just going to Gentiles, and therefore he's abandoned the Jewish people. Like we've alluded to it a few episodes ago, that Romans 9 through 11 tell us that that's not Paul's heart.
No.
But here we actually see that even in biography, he's still actually investing in the synagogues and wanting to talk to them about Jesus.
Completely, and seems to have had a measure of success there. You know, he reasons with them, and then this lovely phrase in verse 20: they desired him to stay. They wanted him to stay longer, but he didn't. Having spent so long in Corinth and moved from there, he is only staying a short time in the context of Ephesus, but promises to return. I will return again if God wills, to you. So, but leaves Priscilla and Aquila behind there. Again, showing a confidence in them, I think, and perhaps when, if, and you know, spoiler alert, we know that Paul does return to Ephesus. We'll come back to that in a later podcast. When he does return, he's returning not just to the place that he promised to return, but he's returning to people that he left there, and they have carried on the work. And again, without going back to what we said in the previous podcast, I think Paul's confidence in Priscilla and Aquila may also be reflected in the fact, number one, he does re-engage with the synagogue, but also number two, that he's prepared to leave them behind. He thinks they have a measure of competence that's good enough to be trusted with that in a sort of original engagement.
Yes. And I mean, there is a blurriness that around the weight of competence that Priscilla and Aquila, like you almost sometimes wonder, is Paul also learning from them? You know what I mean? Like there's all sorts of fascinating things going on there. But then what happens is, of course, he actually appears to have unusually is very well welcomed into the synagogue that he's dealing with there, because there's this invitation to stay longer. We've not got the ordinary disagreements, fallouts, citywide riots, these sort of things. Actually, an invitation to stay longer and I assume discuss these things. But he declines.
Yeah. You know, normally he's trying to stay and they're kicking him out, and here they're trying to make him stay and he's going. Yes. So clearly there's something on Paul's mind. He wants to get to Caesarea. He wants to get to Jerusalem. He wants to get to Antioch, and there's something within him that is compelling him to leave them, even though he's urging them. They are urging him to stay. So that is a fascinating juxtaposition in sort of what the normal pattern that has happened there. But it's interesting. He makes this promise, doesn't it? Sorry.
I was just going to say, I wondered if I was having a look at the textual variants, which I know is superly exciting, but I know the NRSV, even in the English, actually offers us a variant. So this is a huge subject area that I am in no way expert in. In fact, very, very few people are. But in our early manuscripts of the New Testament, occasionally there's some variations in pieces of text. And what you'll find when you're reading the Greek New Testament, the printings of that often show you the majority of the variants that are worth looking at. Occasionally in the English, they'll give you like a footnote pointing out, there's a slightly different variation going on here. Yeah. And it interests me that one of the major variants, so there's a couple of big manuscripts that are taken very, very seriously. One of the major ones actually has the text reads slightly different. So the text that we read says, they asked him to stay on, but on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And we're like, well, why did he not stay? But one of the major variants says, I must at all costs keep the approaching festival in Jerusalem, but I will return to you if God wills.
Yes.
And now, I think it's probably more likely that extra piece of text has been a little bit of explanatory note that some scribe has put in at some point in the text. But it does connect the notion of his vow, not to
Yeah.
restart that conversation,
Yeah.
that if it's a Nazirite vow that he's taken, he would want to be back in Jerusalem to conclude that vow. So
Yeah.
I wonder if this little textual variant has been a later kind of explanation over why is
Yeah.
it? Because it is unusual that Paul finally gets an invitation to stay longer and discuss, and he's like, "No, I'm out of here. I got to go." And it's almost like that footnote in your English Bible offers you a little bit of an insight, at least, into how the early church maybe thought the reason for Paul having to leave was
Yeah.
actually related to his vows. I mean, I don't know if that's helpful to bring up, John. Is that we can always edit it out if it wasn't helpful.
Oh no, I think it is helpful, even if it is an editor's note or a later insertion. It's given as an idea of, okay, that sort of does make sense, that Paul seems to have an urgency to get to Jerusalem when he's got this phenomenal opportunity in this amazing sort of capital city in the province of Asia. Opportunity. And normally when he's been given an opportunity like that, he takes it. So again, it shows a couple of things. It shows, I think, the seriousness of this vow, potentially. Whatever vow Paul had made, this was serious in his eyes, and Jerusalem, in that sense, was his destination. But it also shows a measure of, again, variance in the reaction to him. The book of Acts is good in helping us that sometimes if you're not careful, you get the impression that every time he went into a synagogue, he had a hard time. And actually, here's evidence that in elements of the Roman world, his message of the Messiah is being well received. And people are responding to that message, even within the context of a Jewish community. So there's lovely little bits in that. I suppose that, to repeat myself, the third element is he does show incredible trust to Priscilla and Aquila, leaves them behind and moves on.
And I think I actually think it's all quite wonderful because, I mean, our series is called The Disruptive Presence, and I love the idea that the Spirit isn't spoken about here directly, but clearly is at play in all of it, right? Paul is like there's this potential editor's note or footnote or scribal variant that gives the reason being he's trying to get to a feast or a festival. But I also love the notion that we don't even need to know. Paul in Acts is just following what he feels the Spirit is unfolding to him. And for Paul, if he feels the Spirit's drawing him to Jerusalem, he's going to try and get to Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of stunning thing. The Spirit is such in Priscilla and Aquila that Paul is comfortable to leave them behind. And the Spirit is also present enough that Paul realizes that if he's supposed to come back to Ephesus, He'll
come back. Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? That there's a lovely combination of things going on there potentially, which just lean into this. Do you know what it reminds me of, David? Like, it's okay, Paul, you're an amazing man, you're an incredible scholar, you're a fantastic Bible teacher, but it's not all hinging on you. Like it's not. It's the salvation of Ephesus isn't hinging on Paul alone. The future of the church is not. You sorry?
We need to hear what I realized. What you were about to say is exactly what I was saying. We need to hear. So please
absolutely.
say it.
Yeah, it's not. And if we're not careful, we can tend to think, oh my goodness, if I'm not here, if I'm not doing this, this won't get done. Now, we don't want people to hear what we're not saying. Of course, it's important that we're present, and of course, it's important that we're here. But I mean, a million years or so ago, as a young Christian, pioneering our first church, and my goodness, like just knocking our pans out to try and build something, and trying to use every scheme in the book that was moral and legal to grow the church. And I remember the Holy Spirit just reminding me, and he said something like this, and forgive me if this is pretentious, but he said to me that the Lord managed to run the universe before I was born. And it's just reminding ourselves that actually, though we are important players in the story, little moments like this remind us, look at Paul, it's not all on you. You're not the only tool in the box. You're not the only voice that's being heard, and you're not the only disciple in play. And Paul, though he's zealous and enthusiastic and passionate and relentless, the man is relentless. He also goes, do you know what? I need to go to Jerusalem. Priscilla, Aquila, you've got this. I'll see you later. And by God's will, I'll be back. And off he goes. And you go, do you know what? There's something really powerful at one level about this simplistic little nuance within this statement.
I don't know if I've said this already, John, in a recent episode, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I stumbled recently over, it was my spiritual director actually shared it with me, Pope John the 23rd's nighttime prayer. Did I talk about this recently? I'm drawing a blank here.
No.
So in the way that, I like to produce a quote from a source that nobody would expect, but it's one of the things I hope you love about me.
I didn't see Pope John the 23rd coming in there, so there we are going.
I hope it's one of my endearing qualities that I produce these left field quotations sometimes. But I think you will love this because it so resonates with what you're just saying. So his nighttime prayer when he was the Pope, like obviously he had his prayers that he would pray, but apparently one of the last things he would say was, "Lord, it's your church. I'm going to bed."
It works for me.
And I think it's profound because at some level that's what Paul's doing. Paul is not buying into, oh my goodness, these people want me to stay. I have to now, if I don't stay, what's going to happen and what will God do without me? I love this notion of this man with so much leadership in his church context, just saying, hey, it's yours, God. It's yours. Yeah. I can sleep tonight because the whole world isn't hanging on me. And I love that Paul thinks, I can go to Jerusalem because this is God's church. It's his, and it's if it's his will for me to come back and help you, then I'll come back and help you. And if it's not, I won't. Not as a fatalist. I don't think Paul's a fatalist. It's just he's holding a sense that the Spirit is leading, guiding, disrupting, healing wherever the Spirit needs to. And I my goodness, I wish I was better at that, John. I really do. But it appeals to me.
Oh, well, of course, there's something, I think there's something, if we're all honest, and this will be to a greater or lesser extent in each of our listeners, I'm sure, but there's something within us that likes the idea from an ego point of view that we are needed. From an ego point of view, we can't do this without you. From an ego point of view of please don't go, please stay. We can't imagine life without you. I'm a Liverpool supporter, and we've just said goodbye to Jurgen Klopp. And, younger supporters of Liverpool, it's like the end of the world to them. It's like Jurgen's our hero. Jurgen's done so much for us. He's been our manager for 9 years, and he's done an amazing amount in terms of what he's done for the club and the brand, etc. No question. But of course, I'm old enough to remember one of our greatest managers ever, Bill Shankly, resigning, and people in 1973, 74 thought that was the end of the world, and then Uncle Bob took over, and Uncle Bob won more trophies in the next 9 years and you could wag a stick at. So life goes on, and we tend to think, my goodness, what are we going to do without Bill Shankly? What are we going to do without Bob? What are we going to do without Jurgen Klopp? How on earth is the fledgling church of Ephesus going to manage without the great Apostle Paul? And actually, the Holy Spirit says, well, I'm pretty good at this. I can do this, and I can help you. Now, again, we don't want people to hear what we're not saying. Are people important? Of course they are. Is training important? Of course it is. Is the influence of outstanding ministries important? Yes, and yes. But, there are moments when we can't be there, when even if we want to be there, it's not possible to be there, and the Holy Spirit is still able to work on our behalf. Curtains go up around the world, and the Holy Spirit can work over and under and around a curtain and still build the Church of Jesus Christ. And I think that's a remarkable, it should encourage each of us. It should challenge our ego and remind us we're not all that, and that actually, though we're important, He's the one building the church, and we're, as we said last time, fellow workers with him. But at the same time, recognizing actually whatever privilege we're giving, have the security to sit in that and walk in that, and then let him worry about the rest.
I love that, John. I think it's so profound. And even in Luke's narrative, I love that. And then he set sail from Ephesus. It's just like matter of fact, simple. It just gets in a boat
and he left.
Off he heads. And my goodness, this is going to be a short episode, John, because I'm going to have to edit out that my distracting bit about textual variants. I'm going to have to edit out all that Liverpool stuff because
Yes, sorry about that. I had a moment. I had a moment of sentimental indulgence there. Please, our listeners, you may not even be from the United Kingdom listening to this. You're thinking, who's Liverpool? Who's Jurgen Klopp? And what is he rabbiting on about? But I'm a diehard Red, been one since 1974. So I just had to throw that in, and I'm sure the Holy Spirit will forgive me.
Whereas me, as a Manchester United fan, I'm praying and blessing that Liverpool have as much success after the leaving of their great manager as United has after the leaving of their great manager.
Indeed, let's not talk about that too much.
But actually, there is that sense of in the text, just that I actually am struck by the matter of factness, and I wonder if we should, because Luke is so careful with his words. When he is matter of fact, there's a gorgeousness to it. I'll return if God wills. And so off he goes to Ephesus, lands at Caesarea, goes up to Jerusalem and greets the church, and then goes down to Antioch. I mean, that's a lot of traveling.
That's a lot of traveling.
All just in the hands of the Spirit.
Indeed.
And I really love the simplicity of it. Actually, maybe I'm making too much, but a follower of the way just gets on the way.
Absolutely. No, I love that. I mean, I do love the simplicity and the succinctness of verse 22. He sails from Ephesus across the Mediterranean Sea, lands at Caesarea, and then just goes up to Jerusalem. And we would assume he's giving some sort of report there to the church at Jerusalem, which again shows Paul's commitment to. Now, this language is not used, of course, in the book of Acts, but we may want to use it with a bit of license. Jerusalem is the sort of mother church, the sort of birthing church, the church out of which all the other called communities come from in that respect. And he goes back there and honors that and reports back what he's been doing. Although Luke remains silent, we would assume that. And then I love this lovely little idea that not only does he honor the church at Jerusalem, but then he goes down to Antioch. And you get this lovely sense of returning to the church again that sent him. Now, we've seen this already at the end of chapter 14. Him and Barnabas returned to Antioch after their first journey, their first 2-year journey, and sort of gave a report. And he's following the same pattern. So though he's not with Barnabas now, he's following the same sorts of patterns that they have established, which are patterns of reporting, accountability, ensuring that they're staying on track, ensuring that the leadership of the church is happy with that, and ensuring that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I love that. Here's, if we've moved from Paul being secure enough to leave Ephesus in the hands of Priscilla and Aquila and in the hands of the Holy Spirit, here he is, humble enough to submit himself again to the leadership of Jerusalem and to the covering of Antioch. He's not now this sort of lone ranger doing his own thing and unaccountable to people, but he remains accountable. Even now, he's a well-tried minister of the good news of Jesus. He's still making himself accountable. And that's a great principle, I think.
I really like that, John. I'd not thought about it in that way, that the simplicity and the unity of. I think partially when we're running through these things so slowly, it's easy for all of us to forget the sort of arc of the journey here. He's on this trip, encouraging the church, and And he's doing that under the authority of a sending church. I was thinking back to something we said in the last episode. If you've got Phoebe working under apostolic authority, but Paul is working under authority as well. You've got this ongoing sort of. Yeah, I'm struck by the way you phrased that right now. That the bringing of greetings affirms that point that you're making. Like, I think we sometimes. We sometimes kind of ponder around this notion of your greetings just being Paul saying hello.
Yeah.
But I think you would. I mean, you would agree with that? That greetings is carrying a sort of response. It's a report. It's an update. It's a, hey, this is the list of people that we've encountered. This is what we've done. Now that there are churches in those places, they're sending greetings in the Lord to those new places. Do you think is that kind of tracking with what you're saying?
I think so. Yes, absolutely. And I think it would be, well, for me, it's impossible to think that Paul rocks up to Jerusalem and doesn't talk about Corinth and doesn't talk about Ephesus and doesn't talk about what's been going on in Athens. He will be bringing greetings not only from those Christian communities, but from the fellow workers that he's working with. But also within the context of those greetings, he will be giving report as to how the work is doing. And remember, I know it's a long time in our two text conversation, but it's not that long ago that him and Barnabas were in the Council of Jerusalem and they were given the, if you like, you want to use language, apostolic authority or church authority to go into the Gentile world and to minister. So although he's not with Barnabas now, he still wants them to know he is doing what he was asked to do and he's staying within the parameters of what he was asked to stay within in terms of showing that. And again, it's interesting, he goes to Jerusalem first, then to Antioch, and if he was going to Jerusalem to fulfill this vow, again, that would be a little bit of a sucker to the Jerusalem church, in that they are still seeing Paul remain by identification very Jewish in the context of the proclamation of Jesus Messiah. And I think that would help them as they're negotiating a burgeoning and expanding Gentile church. So remember, at this stage, although we've got Christian communities that are many of them built on Jewish communities around the Mediterranean world, we're now having increasing Gentile communities. We've now got churches growing out of Gentile communities alone. So I think all of those things are part of that conversation of saluting, reporting, remaining under the authority of, remaining accountable, and ensuring that just as Paul would expect Timothy, for example, or Phoebe, or Priscilla and Aquila to remain in the brief that he's given them. So he has to show willing to remain within the brief that he's been given. You know, it's that old principle that in order to have authority, you must be under it. And I think Paul demonstrates that.
And I think it's interesting that I was thinking, as you were pondering, I was trying to hold, and it's embarrassing that as a Pauline scholar, this stuff just doesn't hold in my head all the time. But I was trying to hold in mind that what you're saying is fascinating, because Paul's authority, we're literally hanging through a section and a sequence where there's all sorts of things going on here, both of Paul submitting to authority, but it's around about this sort of era that you've potentially got Paul encountering the beginnings of, he's getting ready to start writing most of his letters. Some scholars think we've probably got Thessalonians being written somewhere around the gap between Athens and his time in Corinth, maybe around about that sort of space, potentially. Then you've got this sort of return to Jerusalem. It's possible, depending on how you structure it, that the conflict that we talk about in Galatians 2 is in the very near future. It could be, that it sort of is happening somewhere around about there, depending on how things work. it's like, so you're actually also getting a strange point where Paul's showing his submission to the Jerusalem church, but he's also holding his authority over all these churches that he's visiting, right? We're
Yeah.
about to get into a stage that he's now realizing, I'm not getting back to them quick enough, so I'm going to start writing to them and folding them out. And as many people will probably know, Pauline chronology is a difficult thing to track sometimes. It's because Luke's not giving us, overly precise dates, and Paul's giving us even less precise sort of references in his letters. But it struck me that you're describing almost a chain of influence, obedience, authority, communication. I wonder if that's the picture that people have of the early church, right? Or do they tend towards seeing it as way more chaotic? Whereas the way you described it, and if you then add the fact that Paul's authority over the churches he's planted, it almost sounds a little more organized, perhaps, than we even expect.
Yeah, and I think, of course, to some extent, you see some of that when Paul engages with Corinth later on in the letters that we have. We have two of those letters. There may have been as many as four written to the church at Corinth, and certainly the first one feels like, forgive my language, listeners, but it feels like dad correcting the kids. You know what I mean? It's like Paul is speaking to a church that he's helped plant, and they need to be sort of brought into line a little bit. And then in 2 Corinthians, the tone's completely different. It's almost like Paul is having to appeal for the right to speak into the life of the Corinthians, because a lot of things are shifting in the sort of 5 or 6 or 7 years between writing the first letter and maybe the landing of the second letter. I don't know, but you've got a lot of stuff going on.
Yes.
So you do get a sense that Paul gets to be an apostle to Corinth because of a relational authority, not because of a structural authority, but a relational authority. Because he's helped plant the church, he's given the authority to sort of speak into that church. But then in 2 Corinthians, there's almost a little bit of a pushback from the church, and he's having to appeal. So I think there are senses of authority lines. There are senses of people understanding that, certainly within the New Testament world, we're still looking towards Jerusalem. At least until AD 70, we're still looking towards Jerusalem church as giving the lead on many of the key issues to do with the church. That will ultimately develop and multiply in different ways. But you do get a sense of it in this early part of the book of Acts. By Paul going back to Jerusalem, back to Antioch, we've got some sense of authority, covering, and accountability lines being created relationally, and therefore dynamically spiritually, I think.
And that's the point that I think came through so clearly in what you were saying, and I hope it was helpful to sort of think about just joining that chain together more in terms of Paul's own authorities. It's really beautiful and fascinating how the sort of network works and how Paul. It was interesting. I think I mentioned this a while back, but I got to go to a seminar with Steve Walton, who's writing a commentary on Acts, and he was talking about how Paul mentions around 50 individuals across his letters of people of significance that he encounters and leads on his missionary journeys, which, that's not all of the people. That's the people that he thinks are carrying some of the weight with him. It's quite a lot of people if you think about what that then represents. This remarkable network of early Christian. I think it was Loveday Alexander that describes early Christianity as. I'm doing this from memory. I was trying to find the book on my shelf while you were talking, but I can't. I think she describes it almost as an early internet. The connection of the churches. Because it seems that not only were they connected almost hierarchically back to Jerusalem, but Paul's relationship with them has them connecting in between
Indeed.
each other as well. He's telling the people in Colossae to read the letter to the Laodiceans and vice versa, and so on. You've got this really beautiful web of connections, and yet it appears to being all held together by their obedience to the Spirit. It's quite stunning.
Yeah, it is stunning. It is stunning, and again, it shows within that it shows the commitment to relational integrity. I think. In the absence of organizational structure, you are reliant on relational integrity that honors people because of what you see the Spirit is doing in them and what the Spirit is doing through them. So, you honor a James because you believe that the Lord has established James, not because an organization has established James.
Yes.
You are going to Antioch not because Antioch has suddenly set itself up as a super church and demands A, B, and C from you, but you're going back to Antioch because that's where the relational crucible was built out of which the Spirit spoke and sent Barnabas and Saul. So in the absence of organizational authority, you've got relational integrity. And I think it's the relational integrity that helps the early church to work. Now, do they have struggles? Of course they do. The letters of the New Testament show many of those struggles. But it works by and large, not because of hierarchical structures imposed, but because of relational integrity embraced. And I think these are men and women that see the work of the Spirit in each other, men and women that see the work of the Spirit in these communities and are prepared to submit and serve each other accordingly, not because of the badges, but because of something of an awareness of the work of the Spirit among them. And I think that's something we need to recapture in some ways. Thank God for organizations. Thank God for organizational authority, but when organizational authority replaces or eclipses relational integrity that's based on a recognition of the work of the Spirit in each other's hearts, we're always going to default to lesser ideas, and we're always going to come up slightly shorter than I think we do. I think the early church thrived because of its flexibility and yet its commitment to relational integrity. And I think those two things help it to grow and expand while remaining connected and submissive.
So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now. So until next time, from John and I, goodbye.